How many reverbs are on your mix bus right now? How many of them are plates? Vocals, plate. Snare, plate. Keys, plate. And it works because plate reverb is the Swiss Army knife of post-fader sense. But if every source in your mix is getting the same dense, smooth, slightly polished tail, you're not building dimension. You're flattening your mix into one ambient layer. Today, we're going to talk about the reverb that plates can't replace, spring reverb, and specifically the spring reverb that talked engineers out of dismissing the format entirely, the AKG BX20, modeled by Universal Audio. This is not a guitar amp boing boing box. AKG built this thing in Vienna in the late 1960s to compete with plates and chambers in serious studios, and Universal Audio rebuilt it in 2016 as their officially licensed plugin. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly when spring wins over plate, why the physics produces that distinctive character, and how to dial in the BX20 tastefully without making your mix sound like a 1965 surf record. If you've defaulted to plate reverb on every source for years and you're not sure why your mixes feel one-dimensional, this video is going to expand your reverb palette in a permanent way. To understand why the BX20 sounds the way it does, we have to go back to the problem AKG was trying to solve in Vienna in the late 1960s. In the 1950s and early 60s, if you wanted reverb in a studio, you had three options: an actual reverb chamber, a plate, or at the low end, a spring tank. Chambers were enormous and expensive. Plates worked beautifully but required a dedicated room and weighed hundreds of pounds. And springs were the cheap option, the kind that lived inside Fender amps and made surf guitar sound like surf guitar. No one would have called them a serious studio tool. AKG, short for Akustische Okinogera, a Viennese audio company founded in the late 1940s, looked at the lineup and asked a different question. What if a spring reverb could be engineered to behave like a plate? What if you could get the smoothness and the density and the controllable decay of a plate, but in a smaller, more affordable mechanical device? Their answer was the torsional transmission line, or TTL, a patented spring system designed specifically to push spring reverb past its limitations. Instead of a single coiled spring vibrating end to end, the TTL used specifically designed springs and a transmission topology that increased pulse density, increased resonant complexity, and dramatically reduced the flutter, coloration, and feedback problems that plagued cheaper spring tanks. The result was a spring reverb that for the first time was smooth enough and dark enough that engineers could actually use it on serious sources, not just guitar amps. The engineer behind this breakthrough was Werner Fide, AKG chief engineer during this era. And in his own words, Fide described the core insight this way. The breakthrough of this design was to use one spring for the statistical distribution of reflections, but it must be sufficiently damped to avoid ringing. In one sentence, that's the entire engineering philosophy of the BX line. Get plate-like reflection density from a single, heavily damped spring. The BX20 itself was a tall rectangular box, closer in form factor to a small refrigerator than a piece of rack gear, and it carried two mono spring tanks labeled Tank A and Tank B, one associated with each of the unit's two channels. You could run it as two independent mono reverbs, or you could feed it a stereo signal and treat it as a stereo unit straight from the hardware. The hardware also gave you remote decay control from 2 seconds to 4.5 seconds, a pre-delay range from 0 to 250 milliseconds, and a low-cut filter and a wet-only output path. all features that help position the BX20 as a real studio ambience device, not a novelty. AKG extended the concept across the BX line over the next decade and a half, and the BX20E arrived in the early 1970s as an iterative update, refined electronics, and chassis tweaks on the same core spring tank mechanism. The compact BX10 followed in the mid-1970s as a smaller, more portable sibling built for broadcast and smaller studios, and its distinctive tone-shaping circuit becomes important later when we get to the actual plug-in controls. The BX25 capped the lineage in late 1970s and early 80s, adding refined electronics and an integrated analog pre-delay section. One historical AKG excerpt says that the BX20 and 25 together defined AKG's reverb identity for years. In 2016, Universal Audio released their AKG BX20 plugin as part of UAD software version 8.3. This wasn't an unauthorized clone. UA partnered directly with AKG Acoustics Austria on a fully licensed, endorsed recreation. UA's framing in their launch materials was telling. They didn't pitch the BX20 as another reverb to add to your collection. They pitched it as the reverb you reach for when plate, tape delay, or digital reverb feels wrong. That's the use case. That's the lane. And because spring reverb is notoriously hard to emulate convincing, the spring is a physical object whose motion is unpredictable in ways a plate or room model isn't. UA used a hybrid delay network and convolution approach to capture the BX20's mechanical, controllable ambience in software. The plugin also adds features that the original hardware never had: a sterilized Tank A and sterilized Tank B as additional modes, a direct control for signal defeat, BX10 tone controls, wet solo, and per channel volume and pan. And UA partnered with 3 engineers to develop the artist preset: Patrick Carney of the Black Keys, Vance Powell, known for his work with Jack White, and Jakar King, known for his work with Kings of Leon. Before we touch a single knob, let's talk about what's actually happening inside a spring reverb. Because if you understand the physics, every parameter on the BX20 stops being arbitrary. A spring reverb takes your audio signal, runs it through a transducer that converts electrical signal into mechanical motion, sends that motion down one or more metal springs, and uses a pickup at the other end to convert the spring's motion back into electrical signal. That's it. That's the entire signal path. The reverb you hear is the spring physically vibrating in a chaotic, slightly unpredictable way, and the pickup is recording its dance. The length, the thickness, and the tension, the number of springs, and the interaction between multiple springs are what shape the timing, the density, and the tone of the reverb tail. A typical guitar amp spring tank has 1 or 2 short springs, and the result is sparse. You hear individual reflections, the famous moaning, and an obvious mechanical character. The BX20's TTL design pushes way past that. AKG's springs were engineered for high resonant density and strong diffusion, meaning the discrete reflections smear together into something that sounds much more like a continuous wash, the way a plate or a chamber does. The result is a spring reverb that still has spring character, that bouncy, slightly chaotic motion in the tail, that natural high-frequency roll-off, but without the obvious flutter or boing of a cheap tank. Now, contrast that with a plate. A plate reverb is a thin metal sheet, usually steel suspended under tension, driven by a transducer at one point, picked up at multiple other points. The metal sheet's 2-dimensional surface vibrates in a far more diffuse, even, and linear way than a 1-dimensional spring does. That's why plates sound smooth, glossy, and predictable. Every input gets a similar, dense, even tail. That's the difference in one sentence. Plate gives you polish and linear decay. Spring gives you texture, attitude and slightly unstable mechanical motion that can make a source feel more human, more haunted, more retro. The BX20 is famous because it narrowed the gap between those two worlds. Let's walk through 5 controls on the BX20 that you'll actually use in a mix. I'm going to hold the rest: input, select, direct, wet solo, link, the artist preset browser, and the full channel 1-2 routing for future videos, because we could spend 45 minutes on those alone. Control 1, decay. This is your fundamental tail behavior knob, sweepable from 2 seconds to 4.5 seconds, exactly matching the original hardware's remote decay range. At 2 seconds, you get a short, almost slap-like ambience. At 4.5 seconds, you get a long, sustained wash that sits behind a vocal beautifully. The thing to listen for as you move it: spring decay doesn't smooth out the same way a plate does. As you extend it, you can hear that mechanical bounce in the tail. And that's the feature, not a bug. Control 2, tank A, tank B select. This is the signature BX20 control with no plate analog at all. On the original hardware, tank A and tank B were 2 physically separate monospring tanks. On the plugin, you can pick either tank as mono or use the plugin only stereoized A and stereoized B modes. Those don't exist on the hardware. The 2 tanks have slightly different sonic fingerprints. Try both on the same source and you'll hear it. Control 3, Predelay. Sweepable from 0 to 250 milliseconds with the default at 0 and roughly 50 milliseconds at the noon position. Predelay is what separates the source from the wash. It lets the dry transient hit first and the reverb arrive a beat behind. On spring reverb specifically, predelay matters even more than on plate because the spring's own initial response is already a little mechanical and bouncy. Pushing it back a few milliseconds gives the dry source room to land cleanly first. Control 4. Tone. The BX20's tone section includes bass, treble, and a low-cut filter. Here's the thing about the BX20's natural character: it's dark. That's the whole point. Where a plate has that bright, shimmering top end that sits forward in a mix, the BX20 rolls off gently at the top and sits behind the source. That contrast is half the reason to use it. The tone control lets you shape that darkness, push the low cut to keep the low end out of your reverb send. Lean on treble if you need a little bit more air on a specific source. But fight the urge to dial out the darkness entirely. The darkness is the BX20. Control 5, dry wet standard mix control. Most of the time on the BX20, you'll be running it as a send. So you'll leave this at 100% wet and ride the send. But if you're slamming it on an insert for a creative effect, maybe verse intimate, chorus drenched, the dry wet ride is where you do that. If you want to see what the BX20 is doing to your source, drop Melda Production M Multi-Analyzer across the send so you can overlay dry versus wet on real audio. That's how you'll catch that gentle high-frequency roll-off in action. If you want to compare the BX20's tone shaping to your favorite plate, Burn EQ Curve Analyzer will show you the EQ transfer function of each in isolation. Pick the simplest tool that proves the point. If you're getting some value from this video, please let me know by clicking the like button. Also, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Don't forget to click on the notification button so you'll be alerted each time I post a new video. I've got many more plugins to cover in the future, so stick around if you want to see those. And if you want to go even deeper on the AKG BX20, every parameter, every routing option, every artist preset broken down, plus a flashcard pack and a quiz to lock the knowledge in, head over to the link in the description. I've put together a complete plugin deep dive package as my way of saying thanks for spending the time watching this video. So now that you have all of the details of what the controls do, let's bring the plugin up on screen and dive into an immersive demonstration. I am going to play 4 sources from a track I'm producing called Am I Cool Enough to Be With You? It's a modern R&B track. Tom Misch meets Leon Bridges territory. We're going to A/B each source through 2 reverbs. Ableton Hybrid Reverb in plate mode. That's an algorithmic plate available in stock Ableton. So you can create this at home with 0 extra plugins. And UA AKG BX 20. Decay matched, pre-delayed match, same send level. The only thing changing is the reverb itself. Listen for the plate's smooth, linear, glossy tail versus the BX20's bouncier, darker, slightly mechanical motion. The BX20 will sit behind the source. The plate will sit around it. First, let's listen to the whole chorus section. No reverb, just Pro Q across most of the tracks.
Am I cool enough to be with? Am I smooth enough to make you move? Do I shine enough when I'm in your light? Could I hold your hand and not lose my mind? You could have anybody, baby, that's the truth. So tell me, am I cool enough to be with? Am I cool enough? Am I cool enough to be with you?
Now, let's listen to the individual tracks we typically apply reverb to. Source 1, clean Strat rhythm. Pay attention to the chord chops. The plate gives you a glossy halo on each chord. The BX20 gives you texture and a vintage rock guitar amp character that the plate cannot produce. Were you able to clearly catch the differences? Did you notice how the plate version flattened against the chord, while the BX20's version felt like the chord was being played through a dark room? Source 2, Rhodes. Same thing, but listen specifically to the tail of each chord. The plate sustains evenly. The BX20 has motion in the tail. That motion in the BX20 tail is the spring physically bouncing. That's not an effect. That's the thing you can't get from an algorithmic plate. Source 3, snare. Drums are where the spring versus plate decision gets really opinionated. Plate gives you that classic Phil Collins drum room sheen. Spring gives you something darker, more haunted, more dub. If you mix dub, lo-fi, or anything that wants character over polish on the drums, that BX20 pass is exactly the sound you've been failing to dial in on a plate. Source 4, lead vocal. This is the moneymaker. Plate is the conservative, safe, beautiful choice on a vocal, and it almost always works. But sometimes the song doesn't want polish. Sometimes it wants mood.
Am I cool enough to be with? Am I smooth enough to make you move? Do I shine enough when I'm in your light? Could I hold your hand and not lose my mind? You could have anybody, baby, that's the truth. So tell me, am I cool enough to be with? Am I cool enough? Am I cool enough to be with you?
For an R&B vocal like this, the BX20 brings emotional color the plate just doesn't. The plate sounds expensive. The BX20 sounds human. Source 5, all tracks. Finally, let's A/B both reverb types on all the tracks we've listened to and bring in the remaining dry drums and bass so you can hear the dark, moody, unstable sound the spring reverb brings to the song when compared with the polished finish the plate reverb provides.
Am I cool enough to be with? Am I smooth enough to make you move? Do I shine enough when I'm in your light? Could I hold your hand and not lose my mind? You could have anybody, baby, that's the truth. So tell me, am I cool enough to be with? Am I cool enough? Am I cool enough to be with you?
Here's the takeaway, and I want you to write this on a sticky note next to your monitor. Plate is for polish. Spring is for personality. Reach for plate when the source needs to sound expensive, linear, and glossy. Modern pop vocals, anything that needs to sit forward and shimmer. Reach for the BX20 when the source needs to sound human, vintage, dark, or moody. Character vocals, electric guitars in indie or rootsy genres, drums in dub or lo-fi, anything where polish would feel emotionally wrong. And here's the pro move. Stop picking one reverb for the whole mix. Plate on backing vocals, spring on the lead, plate on the snare, spring on the Rhodes. Treating reverb as a palette instead of a default is one of the single biggest things that separates an amateur mix from a professional one. Before I let you go, here's what's coming next. Right now, everyone in our corner of YouTube is singing the praises of Softube's Console 1 and their Flow Studio ecosystem. And I get the appeal. The workflow promise is real. But when you actually look at it from an engineering perspective, signal flow, the signal integrity, and where the company is heading strategically, there's a different story worth telling. So next time, I'm going to walk you through why I sold my Console 1, not as an opinion piece, but as a fact-based engineering look at Softube's strategic direction. It's going to be a bit controversial, that's fine. Bring the engineering brain and keep in mind that I am a big fan of Softube, but this isn't about being a fanboy. This is about the engineering behind the process and the workflow. If you found this video useful, share the video with a producer friend who's still defaulting to plate on everything. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me keep making these deep dives. Drop a comment below telling me which source surprised you most in the A/B and which Spring Reverb plugin you reach for. I read all the comments. Don't forget to grab the free deep dive, flashcards, and the quiz. Link is in the description. Remember, none of us start as professionals, but we all become pros through practice and knowledge. I'm Ken. Catch you on the next one.